All right, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome again to yet another IATSE gaming stream. We're not gaming tonight. Um, Tonight we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence. And with me this week, I have two people who are not artificially intelligent. They are full fledged, 100% intelligent. um, But welcome. I'd like to welcome Andrew again. Thank you so much for being here for a multiple of times. Always glad to hear you and have you here. And I've also brought with me this week Ben Spate, special rep for the IATSC and organizer with the Animation Guild, who is paramount to helping our Game Worker campaign. So glad to have you both here. I don't want to talk for you, but Andrew, would you like it to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Andrew. I've been in the games industry for about 15 years now, and I've been a game designer for the last eight. And here to I'm here specifically today to talk about AI in the games industry and how it's already starting to impact things. And I'm also here to help lend what support and knowledge I can to organizing in the games industry space.
Badass. Love that. Um, Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thanks, Chrissy. And hi, Andrew, again. It's good to be with y'all. Yeah, I've been organizing for my entire adult life, over 20 years now, mostly in the South. I've worked with a number of different unions. And as Chrissy mentioned, just over the past few years, animation, VFX, and games, where we made a lot of strides building a national union for those workers in job titles that had formerly been excluded from our union, but we're organizing at a great pace in all of those sectors. So it's great to be with y'all and talk about this controversial, exciting topic of artificial intelligence. But I got a sense that maybe it's not such a new topic after all. Maybe it's a long story about employers trying to squeeze as much as they can out of the collective labor force as possible, and how unions can address that and how we historically have.
Absolutely. Um, so glad to have you all with me this week. Um, so let's kick it off. I'd like to talk about a little bit about where we're going with um, AI for the IATSA, which is like every time I say AI, I'm like IA. But what are we doing this coming year? And the big thing that is coming up for the IATSE is our basic agreement is going into negotiations, and along with that, a lot of conversations around AI because so many of us working in entertainment are affected by it. Um, and just recently, in November of this past year, um, the assistant director of the motion picture and television department, um, Vanessa Holtgrew, went to DC to talk to Congress about AI and urge them to write in protections for workers in our industries to prevent, again, what Ben was touching on, which is the idea that our employers will continue to find ways to milk the most work out of us for the least amount of labor cost. Um, Ben, maybe you could speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, coming in as an organizer, learning about the history of the IEA, I think it would be good for all those that are, tuning into the stream tonight, and those that are IEA members or not, to understand that this union in particular, um, well, like all other industrial crafts, have had to deal with the implementation or the introduction of technology that seeks to increase productivity and efficiency, and decrease labor costs, as Chrissy's talking about. So the our approach to artificial intelligence flows from this long history in the entertainment industry of having to deal with new technology introduced by employers. Um, and it's important to note that a lot of the thinking about artificial intelligence and the the research and seeking to understand its applications and all of its different variations is something that the IA is taking deeply seriously and is incorporating into its bargaining approach with the Association of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the AMPTP, which, as Chrissy said, those that were following the Hollywood strikes and negotiations with SAG-AFTRA and the Writers Guild last year know how big those negotiations are, the stakes that are involved, and it's artificial intelligence will be one of many other topics that are brought up in those negotiations. But I also think it's important to really center the concerns of non-union workers and across the creative crafts, visual effects, animation, and games, and and the real fear that many game workers and others have about the displacement that artificial intelligence could involve in further increasing the number of layoffs and reducing the workforce across game studios here in the States and throughout the world. And the real point that we want to drive home about that is that artificial intelligence, like every other condition of employment, if you work in non-union, it is entirely at the discretion of the employer to determine how and when to use artificial intelligence. It's like it is entirely at their discretion to offer benefits or not, to set rates of pay higher than a minimum wage, to allow job security protections or not. And so, really, what we're talking about tonight is if non-union workers and anybody else in the industry is concerned about artificial intelligence, the best way to address that is to get a seat at the table and begin to negotiate with your employer about all the conditions of employment, including AI.
100%. Absolutely. Always so good to have Ben on. It's got such great things to say. Um, but also welcome everybody in the chat that's new. Welcome Moon Lily, and good to see you again, XLAX Twitch. But yeah, Ben brings up some really great points about how AI is subject to negotiations, and those of us that are working non-union are again the most susceptible to those changes without our consent. Oh, welcome Purple Rain. You're an IA347 member. Glad to have you. Always glad to have IA members in the chat. But yeah, so we're coming up for negotiating the basic agreement this year, and we'll be talking about AI in there. But we've also been talking about AI for a while. We have the AI Commission that is a part of the IATSE, where we are working towards negotiating around AI in our basic agreement, but also following the core principles that we laid out earlier this year, which if you haven't checked those out, I'll post a link in the chat for anybody who's interested in reading up a bit on it. But we can kind of go over them a bit here as well. But ultimately, there's 8 core principles. But the key here is, again, like making sure that we have consent over what happens to us at work and the things that affect us, and therefore not leaving it up to our employers to make decisions for us. But in order to do that, we have to understand. So we have to do research on the subject. We need to understand what AI and machine learning do and how they could impact us. But also educating our membership about those things, as well as how they could possibly implement it into their workflows. Technological change is a huge thing, and we continue to move forward with technology. So we need to be able to understand and address it as we go forward, as opposed to just trying to eliminate it entirely. But also talking with Congress and our communities about how it affects us and what we could do for each other, as well as unions around the globe. But the biggest part of it is organizing, because again, like those of us who are non-union don't have the ability to negotiate with our employers, and therefore prevent these changes. I feel like I've been saying a lot, and I don't want to be saying so much. Andrew, were you able to take a look at those principles, and did you have any thoughts about them?
Yeah, I had a chance to look over them earlier today, and yeah, just kind of going through them. The ones that were that really kind of stood out to me was were ish. The idea that like you need to understand the topic, you need to know like what AI is, and especially this actually came up a couple months ago in our organizing discussions where someone saw a job posting for like an AI engineer in the games industry, and there's already a muddying of the nomenclature there of like AI does not necessarily mean like what we know with large language models. It just means programming how the enemies behave in your video game. So understanding the problem and avoiding those like miscommunications is great. And then maintaining the rights, the job security, and the jurisdiction. Like, I don't know much about the union jurisdiction part of it, but understanding, and I think to what you were saying, Ben, that you're combating the fear of displacement of workers with and the replacement of them by AI, and having that as one of the pillars of this stance against not even necessarily against, but just the stance towards AI and its use in the workplace is good to hear. And also that the fact that you can get a seat at the table to talk about AI has also been really inspiring to me because uh, it's one of the things that I've heard you talking about is that anything can be up for negotiation, anything can be part of a contract, and the fact that like AI is this new you know technology that can serve to impact a worker's well-being and livelihood, the fact that there are already organizations that have AI on their contracts and part of their negotiating just reinforces that like, oh, is this something that could affect us? Let's make sure we're getting ahead of it. Let's make sure we're including it in our negotiations so that when uh, we don't have to wait for a renegotiation or for to be taken advantage of in the meantime.
Um, Ben, do you have any follow up to that?
In organizing, I'll just say, and I think this is something that we all recognize, and Andrew just touched on. Um, but there will be a lot more unions if there wasn't fear that was pervasive in every non-union workplace. And so when the norm is that you have no say over your pay, benefits, or working conditions, and you look at the future of your career that you've invested in deeply with your passion and your hard work and commitment to get into the games industry to begin with, and you see your coworkers getting laid off arbitrarily, or you see people working to the point of breaking down because of crunch, or you see people get so burnt out they have to leave the industry entirely, or you don't understand how the pay rates are set because there's no transparency. You don't even know who to talk to about the harassment you're going through on the job. And in that environment, the introduction of the concept of AI can have no other response likely than that of fear and increasing one's insecurity and about one's career or job. So in organizing, the only way that we can build consensus and build support and the unity necessary to make a demand to form a union is that we have to confront fear. And we have to do so not in a flippant way, not in one that just reflexively rejects things like AI. Well, it's just easier to say we're opposed to it wholesale. Okay. The way to overcome fear is to be reasonable, rational, think through the applications of how the company, these employers are looking to introduce it, and also fundamentally say that the only way that we can begin to set some guardrails around it is get that seat at the table and begin to negotiate. Game workers themselves meeting with their executives and working out arrangements for the implementation of AI in their particular workplaces. And over time, what will happen as we organize more and more game studios is that there will become an industry standard moving forward around the introduction of new technology. But the law requires us to confront fear and build consensus employer by employer. That's a very tedious, difficult thing that it takes game workers themselves leading those organizing efforts. And we could put out all the statements online that we want, but it really takes deep conversations and helping people understand and overcome their fear, um, organizing conversation at a time.
Truth. Um, yeah, it is a long road, but um, if we start now, we'll get to the finish line sooner, right? And that's why it's important for us to continue to have these conversations with our coworkers and also with each other in the games community, so that it's not only educating, but it's empowering each other to know that you're not alone in your feelings about this stuff, and that together we have power. Um, as individuals, we're unfortunately unable to make change, but if we all come together and say we won't stand for it, that's a lot more powerful. Also, I apologize if there's any video lag. I'm doing my best. But appreciate you in the chat calling it out. I'm glad that the audio is working. I feel like the audio is more important. But thinking about how this stuff affects game workers in general, um, something that I've learned a lot from the people that I talk with in the games community is that some people really like AI. I know that for programmers, it's a really helpful thing for them to have at their disposal. But for folks that are working like in animation and concept art and visual sort of media, it is frightening and terrifying to think that AI could simply replace them. But there's certain ways that we can address the issue to make it so that those of us who are using it and really like it can continue to use it with our consent. Again, consent is a huge thing here. And those of us who don't want to be replaced by it are able to maintain our livelihoods and keep working. And I think that, there's things we can look to that are suggestions and inspirations for what game workers could put into their contract, but ultimately that's up to the workers themselves. Ben, I know that we've talked about this because we worked on this really hard for the Titmouse New York contract, but we implemented a thing called technological change into our contract.
That's right.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, Christy led a group of her coworkers and artists to a tremendous organizing committee, and all those that were involved at Titmouse New York and negotiating a first contract with the Animation Guild and her studio, and borrowed a lot from the language that was already in place in Los Angeles that governs the animation work there in LA. That does provide for notice. It provides for job security protections. It provides for workers to be retrained, to be reassigned. It doesn't prohibit the employer from introducing new technology, but it does require the employer to bargain over the introduction of that new technology. And again, it is not AI specific, because take the animation industry as an example. I mean, once upon a time, there was a crisis facing the animation world that if you do away with hand-drawn animation, there no longer would be animation. So if you introduce computers at all, that somehow completely will eliminate the animation industry. And those fears, as well-founded as they were from veteran animators from generations of that craft, was not actually correspond to the future of the animation industry as it continued to evolve and incorporating new forms of technology. I'll just say, zooming out, just one thing I wanted to mention to you or share with you too, Chrissy, is that if we go beyond the animation, VFX, and games world just for a second and just say, how have employers over the past 150 years promoted the idea of automation as just that, as almost an ideology. One that says that workers should always feel precarious and insecure, and that having promotions of technology that can be so disruptive and replace entire industries of workers is something that just gives employers leverage generally. And it's one that they would promote absent the ability to actually introduce that new technology. It's one that they are in favor of as a concept, and actually have sought to promote it. So, but that's not to say they haven't sought to implement it too. I mean, as y'all know, in other industries, take the railroad industry for example, you can have a 3 mile long train, and the railroad industry wants to have a single worker on that train. It's the same thing as we've seen in other sectors. One book that I would recommend to folks to look at artificial intelligence in the history of how employers and corporations have sought to introduce automation is a book called Labor's End: How the Promise of Automation Degraded Work. And it is a long story of trying to maximize profit and reduce labor costs as we started this conversation. So nobody here is flippant or dismissive about the impacts that artificial intelligence can have. Is our deep belief, though, that workers can exercise control over that if we were to do so collectively. And as Chrissy and her coworkers did at Titmouse, they got it in writing. They got language to protect the introduction of new technology, to protect the jobs of her coworkers and the art that they're producing at Titmouse, New York.
It's funny that you bring up old hand-drawn animation. Right over here is my old hand-drawn animation disc. I love that. Peg holes and all. But yeah, that's a really great point to bring up, Ben. The idea that, not that long ago, even, animation workers were terrified that computers would take over. But we've learned to grow with it. QZA75 in the chat says, hopefully generative AI will be regulated. And IATSE takes a realistic stance right now, at least for artists. It's the wild, wild west. Absolutely. It is the wild west. And I hope that if you are a member of an IA local, that you are being participatory and vocal in your local to make sure that your voice is heard, and that your representatives know what you want to see changed for the basic agreement. I know we had the survey that went out, so I hope you took it if you are an IA member. If you're not, then I hope you have the ability to become an IA member in the future. Yeah, and thank you for posting that in the chat too, XLAX Twitch. Appreciate you. Yeah, but yeah, so another way, and I think, Andrew, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, that unions have tried to, or have come around to discussing and negotiating around AI, is what the Writers Guild achieved in their contract. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what exactly they managed to secure. If you know the specifics on that, then please feel free to provide them. But
I
I
apologize,
oh,
Andrew. I
no,
didn't
no,
know.
no, it's okay.
Yeah. So what
Like
they ended
sort of
up getting,
yeah.
what
Go
they
ahead.
ended up getting in their contract was they wrote in language that basically stated that the writers can use AI if they so choose, but their employers could not force them to use it.
Mhm.
What are your feelings on that?
Yeah. So I think first off, I wanted to say thanks for that story, Ben, and also good work, Chrissy, for getting like the idea that you had forward language of any sort of new emerging technology. So it's not just if they go like, oh, well, this isn't AI, this is some other I that we're doing, and it's totally different. Then you didn't give them that wiggle room. So kudos to that, because that's exactly the kind of like BS edge case that the games industry, one, is really good at finding, and two, like we can guard against those edge cases. To answer your question, the idea, like the that's huge. The idea of saying here is a tool that you can use, but you don't have to use it, is it gives agency to the workers, in this case the writer, and it gives them the ability to decide whether or not they want to engage with the technology. And if they end up falling behind, that's kind of on their own, and they need to figure out how to make it work for them. But it's on the worker at that point to sort of make that decision. They have the agency to do so. And I know there was a big fear during the WGA strike of the basically bringing in writers to touch up AI generated writing. So you would have some non writer put in a bunch of generative AI prompts, get a movie script, quote unquote, and then basically hiring a writer to come in and touch it up and proofread it and add that stuff to it, rather than having what I understand are like the traditional writers' rooms and screenplay writers and all of that. Sorry, film folks, I don't know the terms, but the and that's sort of that replacement and displacement that I think you were talking about, Ben. The idea of if you have instead of having 8 writers in a writer's room, you just have one writer who's proofreading and editing what the AI spits out. So that they were able to secure those protections in their contract so that they don't have to necessarily use these tools or be forced to use them is great.
Yeah, I mean, just to real quick, Chrissy, I'll just say,
Yeah, please.
one thing that I think has came up over and over again about this, and maybe needs to be emphasized even more, particularly by the artists that know their crafts and know the skills necessary to do this, is that the prospect, whether it's AI or outsourcing or this seeking to replace highly skilled um, uh, labor that is at a premium cost. Okay. Well, of course, corporations are going to try to find either machines or other human beings to do the work for less. But as we're already seeing, both executives at some of these major entertainment corporations and others commenting, and the worker and the artists themselves, you can produce more volume of entertainment, but are you producing better quality? And are there costs on the backside of that when you have to clean up? How much actually is involved in cleaning up one where you have a non-writer creating a television or feature film script? Like, are we actually just creating redundancies in the system that are not actually going to reduce costs? And as we're seeing from consumers, they know the difference. We know the difference between artificial intelligence generated art already and the quality of what's human made. And I think continuing to advocate for the quality of human generated art is something that's going to align us with the future too, as consumers and the public understand that you just can't replace human beings the way that corporations and their ideologues may promote.
Yeah, like Zaslav started calling um, film and television content. It's just a way of demeaning and generalizing the artistic endeavors that we all do with our creative human brains. And QZ, you're an 800 member. Glad to have you in the chat. That's awesome. I love that you brought up the Awesemo episode of South Park. That's very true. It's just like that episode of South Park. Is South Park the new Simpsons, where like everything relates back to a Simpsons thing that got predicted? Like, didn't Simpsons predict that Trump would be president? Oh, crazy. Anyway, but yeah, the things that we're talking about tonight are things that we have to act on. And the biggest thing that we could do to protect ourselves in the face of stuff like this is to make sure that we have a seat at the negotiating table. And the best way we know how to do that is to organize and get ourselves a union contract. Oscars dresses. That's fascinating. Daenerys, Isaac. I don't know what that means, but yeah. Next week we're actually going to be talking about how the IATSE has set industry standards and in the past and how we can use that to our advantage going forward. Um, but maybe we could touch on that just like a little bit. Ben, you want to talk about that and how that might apply
Yeah, and
to game workers?
I, I'll try to be brief because I don't,
Yeah, save
also
it for
want to,
next week
it's like
too.
I know the least about this topic for anybody, compared to the people in the chat and the people that are here. I just approach it um, from a position of worker power, and one thing that cannot actually, doesn't make a lot of sense, but ultimately we're going to be in a pitch battle around if we were to organize in the games industry now is that the law requires us to organize employer by employer, in some cases studio by studio. So we're a long way away of setting a industry-wide standard around artificial intelligence or new technology. But in Hollywood, because of generations of previous struggles to organize throughout the crafts in Hollywood, there is the prospect of organizing like the writers did for their craft, industry-wide standards that cover small productions and large productions alike, small major and major studios alike as well, because there's a single standard. And that really is the vision for the games industry as far as we can see, is instead of a patchwork of zero standards and some standards and a lot of standards, there really has to be an effort to scale out our organizing, particularly at the AAA studios and then beyond, to say this is something that is coming up from the bottom, not just from executives and their, the folks that they have working for them. I'll also just say that if we're going to wait for the government, the federal or state government, to intervene and set those standards on our behalf, even if we do have advocates like, that go to Capitol Hill and go to state capitals and advocate, we're going to, continue to do that work. And hence our assistant director of the motion picture and television department, as Chrissy started this stream, talking about going to Washington to advocate just exactly for that. Ultimately, the federal government, no government is going to intervene and set those standards absent the demand of workers. And it has to be coupled with broader other demands. I'll just say, Chrissy, Andrew, we've talked to a lot of people in the games industry and others. AI is one of many other issues that people want to see addressed. And the only way that we can get our arms around all of those priorities is to organize at a rapid pace and scale out our organizing across the games industry so we can set the standards that already exist in Hollywood.
Absolutely. Um, how does that sound to you, Andrew?
I mean, yeah, sounds great. I will say that one of the thing, yes, please, and thank you, more organizing. The thing that I think is something that a not so dirty secret of the games industry and game creatives, and I think a lot of creatives in general, is that we borrow heavily from other sources of inspiration and what other people do. You see it, yes, this is sort of a corporate thing, but it happens on sort of a smaller scale too. Of you know, um, Elden Ring came out, and everyone's like, "Ooh, we should make like, how do we make our game kind of like Elden Ring? What are some of the things that Elden Ring does that we really like? And let's borrow that." Tears of the Kingdom, great example, right? How do we start gluing and doing crazy physics simulation? And there's nothing saying that we can't apply that same methodology and that same eye of design towards union contracts, right? If we're sitting there and going, and especially if we look at one place that's organized and they go, "Ooh, what do they have for their?" That's what I'm doing with the Writers Guild, right? I'm taking that and going, what did they do for their AI protections? What did Titmouse do to handle emerging technologies? I want to borrow that. I want that in my union contract. And so on one hand, yes, Ben, the more places that are organizing and the more of those contracts we get, like the more stable and solidified and reinforced that standard becomes. But also the fact that the industry itself is sort of willing to be introspective and iterate on its own content and language will, I think, I'm being an optimist here, but I think will necessarily sort of converge into like what will become a gold standard uh, AI clause in your contract that then gets kind of copy pasted to all of the various places because we'll go, ooh, that's good. Let's take that one. Maybe tweak a couple things here and there, and then we go from there.
Yeah, and I think that what you're kind of referencing is the idea of like that basic agreement, but for games, you know, and hope to get there. We got to start somewhere. And that is with all y'all in the chat. Talking to your coworkers to find out if they're interested in organizing and forming a union at the place that you're working at. Purple Rain going off in the chat. My buddy hired a person to run a warlock for U.S. currency. Is that a game thing? Andrew, do you know a warlock?
Yeah, World of Warcraft has a
Oh,
method by which you can convert your in-game gold into effectively like uh, cash that you can spend in like the Blizzard ecosystem. You can't necessarily like cash out, but if you want to like buy Diablo 4 or something like that, you can kind of stay within that ecosystem.
gotcha. Um, I have been playing a little Diablo, but back in the day when World of Warcraft was real huge, I played it for 5 minutes and knew that it would take my life away, so I stopped playing it. I was like, I will get sucked into this so hard. Um, but anyway, back to the topic at hand. So next week is the CES, which Ben, I totally forget what CES stands for. Um, Computer
I have to go look up that
Electronics
acronym.
Consumer
Summit.
Electronics Show.
Consumer Electronics Show.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, Andrew, you're so much better at this than me. But the IATSE is going to CES to learn more about technological advances that might affect our membership and also game workers because we're continuing to organize in the space. So they're attending a lot of the programming that is on hand. There's specifically a summit at CES about entertainment, Hollywood entertainment, and AI. And Vanessa Holtgrew, our assistant director of motion picture and television department, will be in attendance to learn as much as she possibly can and continue to bring that information to Congress as well as to our membership. But the president of the IATSE, President Loeb, will also be speaking at the event. And also, we'll be live streaming that on the IATSE Instagram, but you can also tune into it on the CES or the AFL CIO's live stream of the CES event to find out what people are talking about there, as well as what the IA is saying about it. So again, like we're continually making sure that we're fully understanding Consumer Electronics Show. Thank you, Sad Boy Game Dev. Appreciate that. We're continually learning more about what is coming up in technology and what is current in technology so that we could be better educated when we go into contract negotiations. Because if we don't know it exists, how can we possibly write language around it? AI all over the Consumer Electronics Show website? Fascinating. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
But yeah, any thoughts, Ben?
No, I think being there is great because it allows us to be present to monitor what the industry is talking about and how they're promoting these ideas and these technologies to themselves, and to help check them and be that conscience that in that room that needs to happen. But to Andrew's point earlier about the gold standard of what may eventually evolve, I think it's in game workers' interest as would be for any worker in any industry to ensure that gold standard isn't set about with the sole objective of maximizing profit for those corporations, and not about ensuring that people that do the work can continue to do so in a sustainable, safe way. That is the purpose of the labor movement. The labor movement acknowledges that technology is introduced in the workplace all the time. Um, but this issue, I think, is a good reminder for game workers that game workers, like animation artists, like those in the visual effects industry, are part of a broader global working class of people who sell our talent, our time, and our bodies in some cases for compensation. And that every day, and employers are looking, no matter how benevolent, no matter how progressive they see themselves as being, are looking to get more out of us. And there's a long history of us saying, you know what, we'll contribute our talents, but it's going to be within these boundaries. We have the right to say no, like the writers have the right to say no. If you want the right to say no in the games industry, there's only one way to do it. And that's to form a union. And that's why we're going to be at CES next week. You know, other unions obviously very interested in looking at this, and looking at it in their own respective realms. I mean, if you were working in the grocery industry, self checkout was like the biggest threat to your entire existence. It would eliminate every cashier's job, right? Automated trucks were a big deal, right? And so if you're a teamster, and the idea of having automated trucks that were running the road, we every time we've seen these new technologies introduced and promoted by industry, advocates, there has to be and has been a counterbalance and a counter to that, to say, what about the human beings that actually make those industries work, to make them safe, to improve their quality, to maintain their quality. It's not just about the pursuit of profit at all costs. And that is the voice that we're going to be expressing at CES next week and beyond.
Absolutely. You're getting a new hashtag in the chat, Ben. Hashtag the gold standard. I love it.
I credit Andrew for that one.
Well, I'll take it.
Andrews. Um, XLX Twitch says they recently fired the whole fleet of Pizza Hut workers and opted for third-party drivers. It's just upsetting all around. Absolutely. XLX Twitch. I did see that, and it's just shameful. As long as companies think consumers don't care where their content comes from, then they will continue to push for automation. Yeah, I had a conversation about that earlier. Thinking about the conditions that, especially for like workers overseas, get put under, and nobody knows about that stuff. Wonder if we did, if we'd change our minds about it. But yeah. Well, I think I'm out of things to say about AI. Andrew, do you have anything that you want to touch on?
Yeah, I guess like sort of in closing and talking about like CES, I think that's hitting kind of number 2 and 4 on the IATSE core principles of like researching what the landscape is going to be like. That's important. I agree with you, Ben, that like that's something that games workers need to get ahead of and understand. And this is like any new technology. This was crypto, this was NFTs, all the Web3 stuff. A lot of that's being driven by the people who make those technologies. Obviously, they're going to want people to buy in and have it take the world by storm. But the workers are the ones who, have managed to push back on some of these things, and being more organized and being able to push back is a great idea. And yeah, and just sort of like looking at AI and the tool as a tool. For example, I was working at a studio, and our art director used AI generation, but used his own art to train the machine to make more of his own art, so that he just had a couple more images to work with. I personally like the idea of using AI as sort of I struggle a bit with like sort of the blank sheet of paper problem. I work better when I have a couple ideas and have it just spit out some rough guideposts for me to work in. Getting past that hurdle, and to your point, Ben, the human element, right? How does the worker use this as a tool to supplement their labor? And like that's sort of the boundary and guideline that I would like to see. And I would as sort of a call to action for all the game workers out there. If AI is being used in your workplace and you, regardless of if you like it or dislike it, or you how you feel about it, that's an important data point to have when organizing at your studio. If you don't like it and you want it to change, that is a great inflection point for, like, let's band together and say, hey, here's our stance on AI. We don't want to do AI. We're going to organize and we're going to do that. If it's something that you end up working with and you end up liking, maybe it's something like what the WGA does, you can say, hey, this is cool, this is good. Let's organize and get this, like, enshrined. Let's get this language clarified and codified, and then share that with the other people. Find the people who are unhappy with AI and say, hey, here's how we use it, and here's our language. Put this in yours and use this for your organizing efforts. And then that way we can get closer to that hashtag the gold standard. Thank you, Purple Rain. So
Hell yeah, Andrew.
that's my piece.
I love that. I'm gonna use that hashtag from now on. Ben, anything that you want to touch on before we close out?
I just think that Andrew's points are so well taken, and game workers, like workers in every other industry, know what is really possible, where they bring their, where these technologies are going to fail, and we as an organization have a duty of putting game workers' voices front and center at the table and publicly, and we will continue to do that. But alienation, the concept of alienation in the workplace is as old as the workplace itself. And how when we start to work for wages and we are provided the tools to perform work on somebody else's behalf, we lose control over those tools and we start to view them as weapons against us. That is a long story, and it transcends across economies and industries. The only way historically that workers have had any say over our economy at the highest levels, from the finance to the workplace itself, is to organize and not to be paralyzed by existential fear that corporate power has all the cards. That's a fallacy. And it's a fallacy that's understood if you have never experienced power in the workplace. But if you're an IA member, you know that we have always, and the labor movement has always set up standards and protections for workers. And we have to continue to be vigilant about that, because every standard that we create, they try to find ways to outmaneuver us. And that's why we have to continue to organize to ensure that if it's about workers, workers have a say in that.
Absolutely. Nothing about us without us, right?
That's right.
Sad Boy Game Dev says, I think audience education is a strong play for us. Many people do care how their games get made. And I think that's a really great point to bring up, is that our communities can support us in our organizing efforts in the labor movement. So, appealing to folks who consume the content, I hate that word, consume the games we create, is really important. Relying on our fellow person in the real world that is not a corporate executive is super important as we continue to organize. But I want to thank you both so very much for being here. Andrew, it is always a pleasure to have you. Ben, it is always a pleasure to have you as well. Y'all are amazing folks and just great to have you here. So appreciate you coming on stream again. Again, next week we're going to be talking about hashtag the gold standard and how we created that in Hollywood and how it could apply to game workers. So I hope y'all come back next week. Same time, same place. And we will see you then. And again, if you are a game developer and you are working at a studio and you want to make change, contact an organizer. You could hit us up at gameworkers.org. There's a contact form on the website. You could also fill out our survey. Share the survey. Share it with your friends. Share it with your friends in the games community. The more people that fill it out, the better. Also, we will be at GDC this year. If you didn't check out the little QR code in the corner, we've got a panel that we're going to be doing in March. Andrew will be there. Stoked. It's going to be exciting. But we'll be at GDC too, so hope to see you all there. Come by our booth too. But we'll see you next week, same time, same place on Twitch. Have a great week, everybody. See ya.
Thanks, Chrissy.
Thanks,
Bye,